flare. And the British had transformed the face of India, but at the same time, India was a British invention, an imagined place brought into being by the surveyors and topographers of the Survey of India. Maps were the key to the very notion of India. They codified the features of a subcontinent, even as they created the rationale for occupation. So it's not any great surprise that the greatest scientific experiment of the 19th century was the literal measurement of India, or that through that experiment would be discovered the highest mountain on the world. Cartographers and geographers knew that the world was not a perfect sphere, but the degree of the distortion at the poles was not understood, and it was of great importance to cartography. And so in 1806, the British set out literally to measure a single arc, a single degree of longitude across the entire length of India. To do so, they had to march the finest scientific instruments of the 19th century, 1,000-pound brass theodolites that had to be carried the length of India. When finally they bumped into the Himalayas, such was the wizardry of the differential calculus and the mathematics that they could actually peer across the Himalaya into the mountains that scored the skyline above Darjeeling, and with incredible perspicacity measure the heights of these mountains. In the first discovery of the highest mountain of the world, the Indian mathematician turned out to be only 60 feet off, estimating the height of Everest from a distance of 200 miles. And so, but it wasn't really the discovery of these mountains that intrigued the British. What worried them was what lay beyond those mountains. If maps were the key to India, knowledge was the foundation of the imperial adventure. Frontiers, Lord Curzon famously remarked, are the razor's edge upon which the fate of empires rise and fall. And what drove the British crazy was that they had no idea what lay beyond the Himalaya. But they did know that as they had expanded on sea throughout the 19th century, the Russian Empire had expanded on land. And every single day on average throughout the 19th century, the Russian Empire increased itself by 55 square miles, bringing it to the very gates of the Raj. And this set in motion this rivalry, famously known as the Great Game to the British, the Tournament of Shadows to the Russians. And it was absolutely beyond the pale, as Curzon saw it, that he had no way of establishing a diplomatic connection with Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, that lay but 250 miles from Darjeeling, a hamlet that exported tea to every village in the British Empire. When two of his letters to the 13th Dalai Lama were returned unopened, he simply decided to invade. And concocting an extraordinary lame excuse, he dispatched Sir Francis Younghusband in 1904, a spy, a mystic visionary, a soldier, the world record holder of the 100-yard dash, which is why he's such a hero to schoolboys throughout England. And his mission was to break the virginity of Lhasa. He did so, and it was the last of the great bloodless imperial ventures, Maxim guns against swords. He gets to Lhasa, and the virginity of the capital is broken, but there are no Russians there. In fact, it's kind of a sordid place. And so suddenly Younghusband has to create another fantasy. So as he marches his troops back toward Darjeeling, what does he see scoring the skyline above Kampazong but this mountain called Everest? So he sends Colonel Rawlings of New Guinea fame and Colonel Ryder, who would later become the Survey General of India, and of course the great spy F.M. Bailey on a mapping expedition to map the Tsangpo, or the Brahmaputra, all the way up to Kailash. And they managed to do it, and they see Everest, and Rawlings in particular becomes obsessed with climbing the mountain. And then, of course, the challenge becomes, in the wake of the war, getting permission to do so. Nepal was completely closed off. Tibet was closed as well. And what had happened is that as Younghusband's invasion crushed the Tibetan army, it achieved two things. It made Tibet defenseless, even as it awoken the wrath of China. And China now had no choice but to act. So the Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama, had fled into exile in Mongolia after Younghusband's invasion of 1904, but now, crushed by Chinese warlords, in 1909, he flees back to Darjeeling into the arms of the most remarkable British diplomat in history, Charles Bell, the first scholar to understand Tibetan society. Bell's got one mission in life: never allow British betrayal of Tibet. And so he becomes the conduit to the 13th Dalai Lama. And in the end, what allows the British finally to get permission to enter Tibet is an arms deal orchestrated by Bell that brings Lewis machine guns, Lee-Enfield .304 rifles, and artillery to Lhasa to protect the Tibetans from the Chinese. And that's the arms deal that allows the British finally to move toward Everest. Now, in the British dreams, they were going to climb Everest in 1914, but the war intervened. And then within a month of the end of the war, Younghusband, who had retained this passion for imperial adventure, attempted to get permission. And that's exactly why he sent Colonel Howard Bury to treat with Charles Bell in Tibet. But meanwhile, he brought to the stage in London this extraordinary character, John Noel, who in 1913, having stained his skin with walnut juice, had slipped in disguise into Tibet, gotten very close to Everest until intercepted by a Tibetan patrol. In March of 1919, Younghusband brought Noel to a joint gathering of the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club to give a presentation. He came to the podium, and as the lamp lit and illuminated the stage with his images, suddenly you could see the cigar smoke through the beam of light, and he just started to shake, because this is a man who had had shell shock so badly, and he pulled himself together and began to tell his story. And it was an extraordinary tale that electrified all those present, but most of them wore evening suits. But his eye went to the khaki. That night, 13 men were brought into the Royal Geographical Society, 7 with the rank of captain, and they were the ones who had written the letters that, with each day of the war, became more sadly abstract as they tried to tell the mothers and fathers what had happened to their dead sons. And as he took to the podium, he saluted Rawlings, who had had the dream of Everest, because Rawlings, and everybody erupted in applause and an ovation, because everybody knew what had happened to Rawlings, or at least Noel certainly did. Passchendaele, the blindest battle of a blind war, saw 400,000 British dead for the acquisition of 5 miles of territory. 92,000 British boys were found so severely mutilated they could not be identified. 42,000 simply evaporated without a trace, including Colonel Rawlings. And so the expedition began. Permission was secured thanks to the arms deal that was worked out with Charles Bell, and then it became who on earth should go on the expedition. As Longstaff had said, the supply of climbers was not what it once was. Well, there were 2 men who stood out, of course: George Mallory, a poet of rock, and this eccentric Australian, George Finch, a master of ice and snow. They were scheduled to go. They were about to sail a fortnight away, when suddenly it was decided by the Everest Committee that both men should submit to a medical examination by Harley Street doctors. Mallory passes in flying colors, Finch fails. Yet this becomes a big scandal, because 4 days later, Finch goes up to the decompression chambers at Cambridge and sets a world record for endurance. And that summer, kicked off the Everest team, he sets records in the Alps. So what has happened here? Well, of course, some people thought that perhaps he was kicked off simply because he was Australian, but for something that deceitful, it would have had to involve the complicity of the doctor of the expedition, Sandy Wollaston, who, as Mallory famously said, was a man incapable of deceit. Well, sometimes when you do this research, you go to military archives, but the really juicy stuff is found in the divorce records at High Holborn Street. When I looked at the medical report on Finch that day, March 17th, 1921, it was totally subjective. There was no sense of pathology. The doctors basically said his complexion was sallow, he hadn't been eating, he looked like shit. So as I got into his private life, I discovered that events had taken a twisted turn that would have left even the strongest of men somewhat sallow. It all began at an officer's dance in 1915 when he met a coquettish actress by the name of Betty Fisher, 22 years old, very pretty. They had nothing in common save the moment, but that was enough. They married, they eloped without telling their parents, leaving their return address as no man's land. He then shipped off to France and Salonika. She, of course, had pledged her fidelity, which lasted all of 2 weeks. A year later, he gets word that beloved Betty is dying in London. He secures compassionate leave, comes back, and discovers to his horror that not only is Betty perfectly well, she's the mother of a child that's most certainly not his. He goes off to the Western Front, finds a cuckold, thrashes him to the point of death, avoids a court-martial barely, goes back to London, secures Betty's pledge of fidelity, goes back to Salonika Front. That fidelity lasts, this time, about 2 months. He arranges to have her followed, verifying what he had suspected, but by this point, he doesn't really care because he's fallen in love with Gladys May, a nurse. And so, as soon as he possibly can, he returns to London to sever his relationship with Betty so that he can marry Gladys May, who by this point is in fact pregnant by a baby boy of his blood. But the problem is, by this point, he has no interest in Gladys May. He's fallen in love with Agnes Bubbles Johnson. And so Gladys May doesn't like this. She's about to give birth to a child. She takes it to court, and the judge on March 2nd, 1920, orders Finch back to the bedside of the woman who's about to give birth to his baby boy. Well, Finch is going to have nothing to do with this, so he does what gentlemen did in that era. He sets up an artificial situation to relieve himself of the burden, and on March 15th, 16th, and 17th of 1921, he sets up a situation to commit very public adultery with a prostitute in room 477 of the Strand Hotel. This creates exactly the outcome he wants, leaving Betty with a choice of enduring public humiliation or granting him his freedom, which he does. The second divorce goes through on December 12, 1921, and within 2 weeks he marries Agnes Bubbles Johnson, who will stay with him for the rest of his life. Now, it's not clear how much of this scent of scandal had percolated to the Everest Committee in the rarefied world of London, but this much is most certainly clear. On March 17, 1921, the very day of the medical examination, George Finch had a number of things on his mind. 2 weeks previously, he had been ordered back to the bed of a woman he disdained who was about to give birth to his child. Out of another disastrous relationship, he had inherited responsibility for a 4-year-old boy that bore his name but was not of his blood, who incidentally would grow up to become the famous British actor Peter Finch. To get rid of his second wife, he had promised her 100 quid a year indefinitely, which was a lot of money for a lecturer who had lost all his family money with the collapse of the Siberian Railroad during the Russian Revolution. And on the very day of the medical examination, he was scheduled to commit adultery at the Strand Hotel in a contrived setup to allow him to marry the woman of his dreams. So as I say in the book, it's no wonder he had lost his appetite. Or that, as the doctors reported, his condition was sallow, his general appearance tired, his condition poor. But here are the men who actually went to Everest in 1921. Now, they look like a rather mousy lot, don't they? On the left, Sandy Wollaston, George Mallory, Guy Bullock, the governor of Bengal, Charles Howard Bury, and the irascible Scot, Harold Rayburn. Let me just tell you how mousy these men were. Let's start with Sandy Wollaston. He was a naturalist and a doctor who on 24 hours' notice responded to an advertisement in the London Times seeking a doctor and a botanist and a zoologist for an expedition to the Mountains of the Moon in Uganda. Without a hesitation, he got on the train, traveled 3 months just to rendezvous with the expedition, spent 9 horrific months with the Baron de Rothschild in the Mountains of the Moon, and when the expedition was over, he thought, well, why go back the same way? So he walked from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the second man since Stanley to do it. But that wasn't enough. His real goal was to climb to the heart of New Guinea. So he goes to Borneo, buys 125 Dayaks, goes to Java and secures 150 prisoners. He has 6 other Europeans with him, and they embark plunging into the heart of New Guinea. And of course, within months, they're all dead. Save 3 men. Wollaston, one Englishman who, in this scene I'm about to describe to you, is prostrate with malaria on a cot, and the only other man who is actually, with it, is actually sitting down with Wollaston for dinner on crates proper cutlery, napkins, eating their sardines, even as the river of the swamp is rising beneath them to their knees. And as Wollaston remarks in his diary, well, at least it wasn't too difficult to do our dishes that night. Or how about if we go across the way to Charles Howard Bury, probably my favorite of all the men in 1921. In 1905, disguised with walnut juice, he slipped into Tibet, traveling to Kailash illegally, then to the Pamirs and Russian Turkestan, Kashmir, the Karakoram. Drawn always to the sacred, he read the works of Krishnamurti, Kahil Gibran. He visited the Buddhist shrines at Angkor Wat, the shrine guardians of China. He spent months with the mystics in Tibet. In India, he once embarked on pilgrimage, naked, his body covered with scented oils as he walked the length of the Ganga. He was famous for having killed a man-eating tiger that had run off and eaten 21 holy men. He was a brilliant writer, a keen naturalist. In time, he would speak 27 Asiatic and European languages fluently. In 1913, on the eve of the war, he went to the mountains of heaven in Central Asia, and in the marketplace he found a cute little Asiatic bear. Well, Agu became his companion. He would march on his pony across Asia with Agu in the saddle, but he took Agu back to Ireland to his estate at Belvedere, and of course, as bears do, Agu grew. Before you knew it, Agu was a 9-foot-tall bear, and Howard Bury's favorite form of exercise was to wrestle naked with Agu in the arbor of his... He was a soldier by training, but not really one prepared for war. But when the war happened, he was ready. He fought in every single conceivable engagement. He was a ward of Lord Lansdowne. It was amazing that he even survived the war statistically, and he only went mad once. And this was at Devil's Wood at the Somme front when he's ordered to dig a communication trench with his men. The lights, it was dark, the very lights flared. The artillery, machine gun fire, they began to dig their communication trench, and they realized suddenly they were not digging through the shock soils of Picardy, they were digging through human flesh. 6 feet deep of cadavers from previous battles as they tried to find their way through to complete their mission. This tells you something about the way the war happened. Now, the expeditions themselves, 1921, it's not to climb the mountain, it's to find the mountain. They begin in Darjeeling, I don't know if you can see here, and critically they follow the route of Young Husband's invasion up over the Jalapla into this tongue of Tibet called the Shumbi Valley that separates Bhutan from Sikkim. And then instead of continuing along the trunk road to Gyantse and Lhasa, they move west, literally walking off the map, following the arc of the Yarchu all the way to Shegarzong, the Shining Crystal Monastery, and eventually to Tingri, that will be their base. Then their mission is really to map the entire region. So Oliver Wheeler does a survey up to the Nangpala, Howard Bury goes down the Rongshar to Lapshe, and Moore's Head eventually to Lapshe, the home of the mystic saint and yogini Milarepa, the great folk hero of Tibet, and eventually they have to explore the eastern faces through Karta, through the Gama Valley and through the Karta Valley. Now on this approach march through the forests of Sikkim, leech-infested forests, a great photograph of Noah Odell in 1924, eventually they reach the Tibetan plateau at Kampazong. And in 1921, a curious and terrible thing happens. Arthur Kellis, a high-altitude physiologist, 56 years old, too old for Everest, simply dies of exhaustion and is buried at Kampazong, within sight of 3 mountains that he had illicitly climbed before World War I. Now, one of the most extraordinary discoveries I made in doing the research for this, all Everest historians tell you that in 1921 there was only one diary kept. Guy Bullock, Mallory's friend from Winchester, his climbing companion, a curt little diary that was published by the Alpine Journal in 1962 in London. People talk about Mallory's journal. He only wrote letters to his beloved wife, Ruth, that are at Magdalen College. Howard Bury did his reports and dispatches for the London Times. But I found this unsung hero of 1921, Oliver Wheeler, a Canadian, the son of Arthur Wheeler, who created the Alpine Club of Canada. I found his son, John, alive, living in Vancouver, 5 doors from the house I was born in. I went to see him, and over the course of a marvelous afternoon, I love Canada. You know what, I mean, we have this kind of interview, and at the end of the interview, he suddenly pulls from his shelf two treasures, two thick volumes of journals that his father kept in 1921 as he marched across Everest with Mallory, never seen by a historian. I was gasping for air. And I was too Canadian to ask to borrow them or even have them. I was just, and then the conversation kind of morphed. You know, he went to Shawnigan Lake School just when my father went to Shawnigan Lake School. John had had a great career with the Geological Survey of Canada. I happened to have climbed a lot of the obscure peaks that he didn't think anyone had ever climbed after he had surveyed them. And this marvelous kind of way in Canada where we all become family, as I went to leave, being too embarrassed to ask to borrow these journals, he simply handed them to me and said, "Son, I think these will really help you." And I have them in my possession to this time, and we will be publishing them in honor of the family in their entirety. Oliver Wheeler is the unsung hero of Everest. It was not George Mallory who found the doorway to the mountain, the North Col. It was Oliver Wheeler. Mallory, as I'll tell you in a moment, missed it 3 times. Oliver Wheeler is the great hero of Everest. The man given the mission to map the inner massif of Everest, he spent more time alone, higher on the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain than any of the men in 1921. But on the very day that Arthur Kellis is buried at Kampazong, this is the journal entry from Oliver Wheeler. "Well, they buried the old boy in the morning. Thought it would be the afternoon. Terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. How do you miss the interment of one of the 6 men you're walking across Tibet with?" Well, I knew there had to be something to the story. I knew the answer lay on the Western Front. Wheeler was the greatest soldier the Canadians have ever produced. At RMC, he won every single award. He was an extraordinary man who in time would become the Surveyor General of India, knighted by the king. In time, he would do more than anyone alive to keep the Japanese out of India in World War II. But at this point, he's still a young soldier. He was with the 7th Mer Division of the Indian Corps that sailed for France in the immediate outbreak of hostilities. And within 2 months of the outbreak of the war, the British Regular Army was annihilated. The entire British sector of the front was held by the Canadians in the north and the Indian Army in the south. By this point in time, the topography of Armageddon had taken form. The trenches reached the coast from the Swiss border, and both sides were beginning to sap each other with trenches that went out at 90 degrees to get close to your enemy line to attack. It came to the attention of Wheeler's command that the Germans had put 2 saps within 30 feet of their front line. In November 14th of 1914, he was ordered to go over the top and not only bury those saps as a Royal Engineer, but to do so in a way that the Germans would never try that tactic on his front again. They go over the top, the rattle of machine gun fire, explosives, artillery barrage, very lights flashing, and to their horror, they discover the saps are full of Germans about to attack them. The result is a melee of hand-to-hand combat of the worst sort imaginable. Eyes gouged out, ears bitten off, skulls crushed by clubs. Eventually, the Indians push the Germans back, but not before the sap is lined 3 bodies deep, chest to chest, of dying boys of both sides, as he recalled, flailing about like trout in my kraal. He did his best to get his own wounded out, but he never knew if he had succeeded. And in the end, he had to bury all of them alive. So when he talks on Everest of not liking funerals, that's what we're talking about. And that's the resonance of the war, of this extraordinary, heroic Canadian, the first Canadian on Everest, and the man, not Mallory, who found the doorway to the mountain. So the attempt then became, you know, you had Wheeler coming here to the Nangpala, really exploring all the highest reaches. Meanwhile, Mallory and Bullock make a beeline for the Rumba Glacier. Here's the crew on Everest looking a little bit more seasoned. And here we have Mallory comes up to the Rumba Glacier, and to Mallory's credit, he was a ridge walker. He's looking for a route to a ridge. He comes up the Rumba Glacier all the way here. He explores the West Rongbuk. He looks down into the Hillary route that would be conquered in 1953, but the problem was not the Khumbu ice field, but the Western Khum. You know, that vertical thing of ice that goes up to the South Pole, impossible to climb in 1921 without front-pointed crampons. They would have had to chop steps the entire way. Mallory was perfectly prepared to violate the sovereignty of Nepal, but he wasn't prepared to take on the Western Khum in boots of leather with, you know, without crampons. But what Mallory does see in his explorations is this: the North Col, the saddle between the Changtse and Everest itself, what becomes known as the Col of our desires. It cannot be climbed from this side, and the challenge was, how do you find out how to get around to climb it from the east? Mallory, from Re-Ring, saw this East Rongbuk opening. Twice he passed by it. He didn't understand its significance, but Wheeler had a topographer's eye. Wheeler, mapping the mountains, saw what this meant, and he goes up here. By that point, Mallory and all have retreated to the east face, and a sketch map reaches them later in the expedition. Now, this is what Mallory saw. There's a lot of hippie ethnography in current accounts of Everest. You always hear Everest described as Shomalungma, goddess mother of the world. Complete bullshit. In fact, Everest was not a sacred mountain at all. In fact, the reason the Sherpa had no problem climbing Everest is that the deities of Everest had been so thoroughly tamed by Guru Rinpoche, who spent 9 months in the valley in solitary retreat. Everest wasn't any more than Rongbuk. You know, you hear people talk about the Rongbuk monastery of being from the time immemorial. It was actually built in 1910 by Zatro Rinpoche as a series of monasteries that were built based on the new wealth of Solokhumbu in Nepal, the wealth of the Sherpas that had been created because the British introduced the potato into Solokhumbu in the 1870s. And you hear all this, but Rongbuk was the creation of this remarkable Lama, Zatro Rinpoche, and one of the things I wanted to do in the book was tell the story from the Tibetan side. And so I did a number of things. First of all, I knew that Zatro Rinpoche, like all great lamas, had written a spiritual autobiography, a Namtar, and I got hold of it, and for the first time had it translated by Buddhist monk scholars in Kathmandu. Also, I knew that when the Chinese invaded in 1959, the Rongbuk monastery, the spiritual heir of Zatro Rinpoche, Tulsigur Rinpoche, carried the monastery across the Nangpala and established it anew at Tupten Choling in Nepal. So I spent months in meditation at that monastery, because to be at that monastery was to be at Rongbuk in 1921, because the spiritual practices were not random. They were part of a fixed liturgical calendar. So to witness what was going on in Tupten Choling was to know what went on at Rongbuk. I also studied the practice of Shud, the cutting through process, which brought all these lifelong retreatants to the harsh, desolate slopes of Tibet, of the Rongbuk. And also I knew that from a friend of mine, Hildegard Dienberger, the world's authority on sacred geography in Tibet, that all the valley around Everest was in fact mystic space. These were the hidden valleys of Kembenlun, where Guru Rinpoche, when he brought the Dharma to Tibet, had sown mystic treasures that became physical guidebooks and metaphysical guidebooks for revelation. And even to walk into these sacred valleys like the Gama Valley in the east face of Everest was to walk into a radiant Buddha field, a single mandala that was anchored by the sacred mountains. And this was, of course, the origin of the idea of Shangri-La. And Hildegard Dienberger is an anthropologist at Cambridge. I spent weeks with her as I studied this notion of sacred geography. Eventually, of course, the British in 1921, having failed to go up the East Rongbuk Glacier because Wheeler's revelation was ignored by Mallory, and by the time people realized the significance, it was too late. They got to the head of the Karta Valley, and finally they looked down on what Mallory called the Col of their desires, the head of the East Rongbuk Glacier. Now, even as Mallory took this photograph, the night he took this photograph, he wrote his beloved wife Ruth and said, "If only we knew where this glacier ended up." Well, of course he knew, because Wheeler's map 2 weeks before had showed him. I mean, he lied twice to his wife to deny Wheeler his achievement. And of course, the fantastic thing is, you know, Mallory was famously mercurial, and when push came to shove, and when it was time to climb that North Col, in addition to Guy Bullock, what is the one man on the expedition he takes with him? Oliver Wheeler. And as they crested that North Col, as the sort of culmination of 1921, they were met with a wind like no human being had ever encountered. They all thought it was going to suck the oxygen out of their body and they were going to die. And Wheeler, in his journal, writes the only way he survived was by remembering what he had done on the Western Front during artillery barrages. He simply shut his eyes and slowed down his breath and slowed down all of time. And that's how he survived the North Col. And the culmination, the great climax of 1921 is that Mallory finally understands the worth of Wheeler. And that night, as they retreat from the North Col, Wheeler's feet are frozen to the knees. And George Mallory, who has famously disdained this Canadian, spends his entire night rubbing Wheeler's feet with whale oil, because he understands that Wheeler was truly a great climber. So 1922 comes along, should be a piece of cake, straight beeline to the North Col. The personnel changes, and one of the men picked up is this extraordinary man, John Morris. He was not a man ready for war. It was not patriotism but boredom that led him as a bank clerk to enlist, and a class structure, as he put it, impossible to resist, that led against all military logic for him to be promoted to the rank of an officer. He tried to lose his virginity the night before he went to war with a Nottingham prostitute. He fled her room without even having shed his trousers, but still was convinced he had contracted a foul disease. He loved the beautiful notes of Debussy, the poetry of Keats. He got to the battlefront, and though he was practically blind, he discovered that he knew how to kill. He spent 4 years at the front killing Germans until finally he escaped by joining the Indian Army, saving his life. But in 1921, on the northwest frontier, 1 month before he joined the Everest Party in Darjeeling, his command was attacked by tribesmen. They were ambushed. He escaped with a handful of men back to the safety of the fort, and as he looked out into the setting sun, as the vultures swirled around the dead, one form came stumbling out of the darkness, and it was one of his soldiers who had been flayed alive, and his testicles hung like sinew at his knees.